Have you ever paid for a luxury service only to be treated like you didn't deserve it? The scrutinizing glance of a flight attendant, the half-smirk from other passengers, and the cold words, "Sir, you must have bought the wrong ticket." Moments like that aren't just a denial of a seat. They're a denial of you, your humanity, your worth, and everything you've worked for to get there. We all crave a world where our value isn't measured by our skin color, our clothes, or the way others look at us. A world where you can walk through any door you've paid to open and be greeted with the simple respect you deserve. But that night, on a luxury flight, that didn't happen. A well-dressed black man, holding a first-class ticket, was treated like an intruder by the captain and crew. They didn't know and didn't care who he was. What they didn't expect was that they'd picked the wrong man to humiliate, because just 10 minutes later, the entire plane came to a halt, and the captain dragged out of the cockpit in front of everyone's stunned eyes. This isn't just a story about a denied seat. This is a story about dignity, silent power, and how one man flipped the entire game with nothing more than a smile. If you've ever been treated like you don't belong, hit like, share this story, and subscribe, because this story will make you smile at the end. And now, let's go back to the moment it all began. Elijah Carter walked into first class with the composure of a man well accustomed to the doors of luxury. His light gray suit hugged his frame perfectly, his polished black leather shoes reflecting the soft cabin lights. Everything about him radiated success, yet that success wasn't enough to thaw the ice in the eyes that followed him. The flight attendant, a blonde woman with her hair neatly pinned back and a smile so practiced it could have come from a manual, stepped forward. Her gaze scanned his suit, his skin, the ticket he held out. She paused, just a beat, but long enough for Elijah to feel the full weight of her judgment. Then, in a voice soft as silk, yet cold as steel, she said, "Sir, are you sure you bought the right ticket?" The words dropped between them like a stone sinking to the bottom of a lake. It wasn't just a refusal. It was an assessment, an unspoken message. You don't belong here. Other passengers, middle-aged men, hunched over laptops. Busy women scrolling through itineraries looked up, their curiosity barely masked. A black man, dressed impeccably, standing here, something felt out of place in their familiar script. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He looked at the attendant, calm as if reading a passage he'd seen 100 times before. The silence stretched, and in it came the memories of all the rooms he'd walked into, boardrooms, hotels, conferences where he'd been treated like an uninvited guest. He remembered the long nights in his youth, having to prove piece by piece that he belonged in spaces of power. And now, even as the man who owned an entire airline, they still wanted to push him out of a seat he had paid for. He held the ticket out again, one last courtesy. The attendant took it, but her hand trembled slightly. Behind him, a man in a white dress shirt let out a low whistle and muttered to his neighbor, loud enough for Elijah to hear, "Looks like someone's trying to sneak into first class." A few chuckles followed seasoning for the humiliation. Elijah smiled. Not the polite kind, but the kind that makes people wonder, is he letting this slide, or is he waiting for the perfect moment to collect his due? And that moment, it seemed, was closer than anyone realized. Can you imagine what happens when a man like Elijah decides he won't leave quietly? The attendant still held his ticket, but her eyes weren't on the printed words anymore. She looked at Elijah as if he were an object clashing with the carefully curated decor of this cabin. Her smile strained, artificial, wavered slightly. The kind of smile people wear when they've spotted a problem but won't say it outright. "Sir, if you could please step aside while I verify your information," she said, her tone still sweet, yet heavy with the subtext. "You're a problem." Elijah shifted slightly to the side, saying nothing. His eyes swept the cabin, the men in navy suits glued to their tablets, the silver-haired woman adjusting the Hermes scarf around her neck, They glanced at him the way people glance at someone who's wandered into a restaurant where they don't belong. Elijah knew those looks. They weren't curiosity. They were confirmation. You don't belong here. Then another voice cut through the cabin deeper, heavier. What's going on here? The captain appeared, tall, broad-shouldered, with the sharp-eyed authority of someone used to giving orders. He stared at Elijah, irritation plain on his face. First class isn't a place for disruptions, the captain said, skipping any semblance of basic courtesy. A wave of silence rolled over the cabin. Passengers sat up straighter, a few phones tilted discreetly. Recording. Whispers broke out in the rows behind. What's happening? Does he even have a real ticket? Elijah didn't react. No arguing. No explanations. He stood tall, eyes fixed on the captain. His silence so heavy it shifted the air in the room. Something about that silence silenced the chucklers. This wasn't the quiet of a man beaten down. This was the quiet of someone who had already calculated every move and knew exactly where he stood. The attendant, sensing things spiraling, interjected quickly. Let me just recheck. There could be some kind of... But the captain wasn't listening. He waved her off and barked, Get him off! Don't waste my time! And that's when Elijah tilted his head slightly, as though he'd just heard something amusing. The smile returned wider now, sharper. No one in that cabin knew it yet, but the game had just changed. Do you want to know what happens when the man they thought was a disruption turns out to be the one holding all the power on this flight? Elijah didn't argue. He didn't justify himself. He didn't even mention the perfectly valid ticket still clutched in the attendant's hand. He simply stood there, posture straight, arms loose at his sides, a statue of composure in the middle of a brewing storm. That smile remained subtle, deliberate, but it had transformed into something more. It wasn't the smile of someone making peace. It wasn't a conciliatory gesture to keep things calm. It was the smile of someone who knew more than he was letting on. The captain stayed rooted in place, suspicion creeping in around the edges of his irritation. He was used to absolute authority in this domain. The cockpit was his throne, first class his court, but Elijah's silence bent that rhythm of power, leaving the captain uncomfortably aware that he might have overstepped. The attendant cleared her throat, desperate to reclaim control. If you could please step outside, we can. Elijah cut her off not with words, but with action. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Not in a rush, not hiding. He moved like a man making himself at home in his own office. His fingers danced over the screen. The captain stepped forward. What are you doing? I asked you to cooperate. His voice no longer boomed with full authority. It carried something new, a hint of unease even he couldn't name. Elijah looked up, locking eyes with the captain. Just contacting a colleague, he said softly, like this was a private matter that no one else needed to concern themselves with. No one in the cabin knew that Elijah's colleagues were the kind of people who could stop an entire flight with a single phone call. The smile stayed, but now it was no longer just a smile. It was a warning. A storm was coming. And no one in that cabin realized they were standing in its very center. Can you picture what happens when that smile turns into action? The laughter started from the row ahead, a soft, cutting chuckle, the kind people use when they want to stab at someone's dignity while pretending to be harmless. Elijah heard every word, but he didn't turn his head. He knew that laugh well, that cheap little sound people made to reduce his presence to a joke. Looks like he's trying to hitch a ride in first class. The man continued, this time loud enough for several rows to hear. A few heads turned. Then more laughter followed, quick and shallow, like a spark jumping across dry straw. Elijah didn't move, didn't respond, didn't explain. He stood there like a statue in the wrong place, too heavy to be moved. His silence only made the mockers feel bolder. A young woman near the window whispered, He probably doesn't even know how much first class costs. Oh, he knew. God, he knew better than anyone here. Elijah had once gone a week without a hot meal, had worked himself to exhaustion for scraps of a paycheck. And now, even as a man who could afford not just a seat, but the entire airline, the same words still circled him as if nothing he had done was ever enough to break out of the mold they'd placed him in. He studied them from the corner of his eye, the man with the champagne glass, leaning back smugly, the flight attendant trying to maintain her professionalism, though her hands trembled as she held his ticket. They all believed they knew him, a man who didn't belong here, a man who would leave quietly, knowing his place. But Elijah wasn't leaving. And he wasn't the kind of man who stayed silent out of fear. His silence was measured like a conductor waiting for the precise moment to raise his baton. There's a difference between the silence of the weak and the silence of the strong. The weak stay silent because they dare not speak. The strong stay silent because they are choosing the moment when their words will cut deepest. Elijah was the latter. The captain began losing patience. "I don't have time for this," he said, his voice edged like a command. But this was the moment Elijah chose to teach the captain a lesson about time and power. Can you guess what a man like Elijah might do to make an entire plane stop for him? Elijah reached into the inside pocket of his suit and drew out his phone. Not hurried, not flustered. He unlocked it with the practiced ease of someone used to working even in spaces that weren't meant for him. The glow of the screen lit his face, serene and calm, the opposite of the storm brewing in first class. No one knew what he was about to do, but every eye in the cabin was on him. The man with the champagne glass let out a scoffing laugh and muttered, probably calling a buddy to brag about touching a first-class seat. A few more giggles, but this time, something in the air made those laughs die out quicker. Elijah lifted the phone to his ear. His voice was soft, almost polite, but clear enough that even the flight attendant beside him could hear "Activate emergency authority. Stop this plane now." The attendant blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry. Did you just say—" Elijah didn't answer. He stepped aside slightly, listening to the response on the other end. "Yes," he continued, calm as ever, "immediately. I'll handle the rest." Then he hung up, slid the phone back into his pocket, as casually as if he'd just ordered a coffee, not halted a commercial flight. The captain had heard. His face changed, struggling to maintain authority but unable to hide the flicker of unease. "Who did you just call? Who do you think you are that you can—" Elijah turned back, locking eyes with him. No anger, no bluster, just one thing, silent power. The flight attendant, still shaken, bent to recheck the ticket as if some error on paper could undo what she'd just witnessed. But there was nothing to check. Everything was valid. The only truth left was that she and the captain had treated a man without realizing exactly who or what they were dealing with. And then, before anyone could speak again, the overhead PA crackled to life. The cold, steady voice of ground control filled the cabin. "This flight is now delayed for special reasons. All passengers remain seated." The air froze. The smug laughers glanced at each other, whispering as if they were witnessing something beyond their comprehension. And Elijah, he sat down in the aisle seat, buckled his belt, and closed his eyes. No one understood what had just happened. And that uncertainty terrified them more than anything. Would you like to know what kind of man can stop a plane with a single phone call? The intercom echoed through first class again, cold and final. "This flight is now delayed for special reasons. All passengers remain seated." As the announcement ended, silence shattered into anxious murmurs. A woman in an evening gown unbuckled and turned to her husband. "What's happening? Are we stuck here?" The man with the champagne from earlier set his glass down, the smugness drained from his face. Eyes that had mocked Elijah minutes ago now studied him differently, wary, calculating. The flight attendant scurried off toward the galley, whispering urgently into a phone. The captain disappeared into the cockpit, the door slamming shut behind him. A junior crew member darted in and exchanged hushed words with the lead attendant, both of them glancing nervously at Elijah before turning away. Elijah remained where he was. He didn't speak, didn't meet their stares, didn't do anything except recline slightly and rest his eyes. To an outsider, he might have looked like a man relaxing before a long flight. But to those in the cabin, he was the calm eye of a storm they couldn't predict. That silence of his spread like a command. The whispers dulled, the chuckles vanished. No one dared to add another joke. Slowly, everyone began to understand this man, the one they had dismissed. The one the captain had tried to eject had just ordered something they themselves, with all their first-class privilege, could never do. He had stopped a commercial flight. Elijah opened his eyes, glanced briefly at his watch, and drew a slow, deliberate breath, as if everything was unfolding exactly on schedule. He didn't need to say a word. His silence now weighed more than any speech. From behind, a passenger whispered to their companion, "Who is he? How can one call do that?" That question echoed in every mind on board. But only Elijah knew the answer. And they didn't yet realize the real earthquake hadn't even begun. The cockpit door swung open. The captain stepped out, face dark as a man yanked from his own throne. His eyes scanned first class before locking on Elijah. That look wasn't contempt anymore. It was a mixture of anger and something else he couldn't hide, unease. "What the hell did you just do?" The captain's voice cut through the thick silence. It wasn't a real question. It was a performance, an attempt to reclaim control, to remind everyone that he was, supposedly, the master of this aircraft. But even as he barked, there was a tremor in his tone, the sound of a man realizing the balance of power had just shifted out of his hands. The blonde flight attendant still clutched Elijah's ticket like a shield, forcing a smile that quivered at the edges. I think there's been a misunderstanding," she stammered, glancing at the captain as if grasping for backup. "Maybe he doesn't know the policy. I was just verifying his information." Elijah tilted his head toward her. He said nothing, but the way he looked at her made her flush, eyes darting to the floor. In that moment, she understood she wasn't the one enforcing the rules here. Not anymore. The captain stepped closer to Elijah, forcing a strained diplomatic smile that dripped with condescension. "Sir, you're disrupting our flight. This behavior is unacceptable. You need to cooperate and leave this cabin before things get more serious." More serious. Elijah almost laughed. He was sitting in first class, the flight grounded by his command. And this man who just tried to throw him out like an unruly stowaway still thought he had the final say. Elijah didn't answer. He simply let the captain stand there, listening to his own words echo back at him. Silence. Elijah knew was more terrifying than any reply. A man in seat 1C, who'd been watching like it was theater, whispered to his companion, "Feels like the captain's the one being sent to the principal's office." The cabin stirred with murmurs again, but different this time. Not mocking, speculating, wondering. Who the hell is this man and how did everything flip so fast? Elijah remained perfectly still, fingers interlaced, the very picture of a man who wasn't cornered but waiting. They didn't know the farce was only beginning and the lead actor on this stage wasn't the captain. Then came the staccato rhythm of heels striking the plane floor. All conversation stopped. The first-class door opened, and a woman in a Navy power suit entered. She wasn't a flight attendant. She wasn't ground staff. The polished silver nameplate on her chest said it all, Director of Flight Operations. First class had never been this quiet. Those who'd been laughing earlier now exchanged nervous glances. The blonde attendant froze like a child caught stealing. Even the captain, blustering and loud a moment ago, folded his hands in front of him like a student awaiting his reprimand. But the woman didn't look at them. Not a glance for the captain, not a word for the attendant. She walked straight toward Elijah. Her steps were quick but unhurried, the stride of someone who knew exactly where the real authority in this room sat. When she reached him, she dipped her head, a perfectly measured gesture of deference, practiced for moments that mattered. Her voice was low, steady, and carried the weight of confession. "My apologies, sir." "Sir." That word fell like a stone in water, sending ripples of shock through the cabin. Elijah opened his eyes and looked at her. No surprise, no false modesty, just a slight nod, the acknowledgement of an apology that was long overdue. The blonde attendant looked petrified, red creeping up her neck. The captain, the man who'd been ready to have Elijah dragged off this flight, looked hollowed out, his authority crumbling. And the passengers, they were buzzing now. "Who is he?" one whispered. "Why is the director apologizing to him?" The woman continued, loud enough for the captain and anyone listening nearby to hear. "We've been informed by corporate headquarters. This situation is unacceptable. I'm here to personally resolve it." Every word was a slap to the captain, the man who believed himself king of this vessel. He shifted, scrambling to salvage his dignity. "There's been a misunderstanding. I was simply following company policy. No one informed." She turned her head, cutting him off with a glance so cold it could have frozen the cabin air. "You don't need to say anything further." Silence. In that moment, Elijah wasn't just a passenger. He was the gravitational center of the entire plane. No one could deny it now. But none of them yet knew the most unsettling part. That apology. It was just the prologue. First class felt suffocatingly still. The hum of the air vents the only sound breaking the quiet. Those who'd laughed minutes ago shrank into their seats, their earlier bravado collapsing under the weight of shame. A woman in a fur-lined coat tugged her scarf up around her face, as though it could hide her from what she'd just witnessed. "Who is he?" came a hushed voice from the back. No one answered. They couldn't. But every mind in that cabin was piecing it together, the black man they'd dismissed, the phone call that froze an entire aircraft, and now a senior director delivering a personal apology. The captain, once swaggering like a monarch, stood mute, his face twitching with the effort of masking his humiliation. The blonde flight attendant clutched Elijah's ticket like it burned her, staring at the floor as though hoping it would swallow her whole. Elijah's gaze swept the cabin, calm and unhurried, landing briefly on each face. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His very presence and everything that had unfolded in the last few minutes screamed louder than any words. The man with the champagne glass blinked rapidly, staring at Elijah as if trying to erase the memory of having mocked him. A collective embarrassment settled over first class. These were people accustomed to excess respect, used to existing in spaces where they were the apex of the food chain. Yet here they were, unwilling witnesses to the public unmasking of their own assumptions. One passenger whispered to another, "He must be someone huge." The other nodded slowly. "Huge, and we didn't even realize." Elijah kept that slight, razor-thin smile, the kind that made the cabin feel heavier than any shouting ever could. He tilted his head, giving them time to absorb the reality. Everything they thought they knew about power, status, and who belonged here had just been turned inside out. And the worst part, this was only the overture. The woman in the navy suit, still standing tall before Elijah, took a deep breath before turning to face the entire cabin. She was no longer whispering. Her voice was steady, clear, and loud enough for everyone on board to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Mr. Elijah Carter, the Chief Executive Officer of the corporation that owns this airline." The air froze instantly. A few passengers mid-sip stopped cold, their glasses suspended mid-air. The woman in the fur coat sat up straighter, too stunned to fix the silk scarf now crooked around her neck. The captain stood rigid, eyes widened as though trying to confirm if he'd misheard. The blonde flight attendant lowered her head, squeezing Elijah's boarding pass so tightly it crumpled in her hands. Whispers spread through the cabin, no longer cheap giggles, but hushed words laced with shock and disbelief. "He's the CEO. God, what did we just witness?" Elijah said nothing. He remained seated, one leg crossed over the other, back straight, his face calm as if this revelation was the most natural thing in the world. No boasting, no need for emphasis. His silence now carried more weight than any speech. The captain swallowed hard. Just minutes ago, he'd been barking orders to throw Elijah out. Now, with the truth laid bare, he looked like a student caught lecturing the professor. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a rasp came out. The woman in the navy suit turned to him, her gaze like a blade. "Captain, we'll be speaking later." That single sentence cut him down. He stepped back, silent, face flushing with humiliation. The passengers' people who moments ago believed themselves the center of the universe now sat frozen, trying to make themselves invisible. Every judgmental stare they'd thrown at Elijah now boomeranged back at them, stripping them bare. Elijah tilted his head slightly, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't triumphant. It was sharper than that, the kind of smile that made anyone who saw it feel exposed. And then, his first words since the revelation. "Thank you for showing me how my company treats its customers." The line was soft as a breeze, but it hit the cabin like a slab of concrete. No one dared breathe too loud. Can you imagine what happens next when the man they dismissed now holds the fate of everyone who insulted him in his hands? The captain cleared his throat, reaching for the armor of his authority. I was simply following protocol," he said, forcing his voice into something resembling calm, though the tremor in his words betrayed him. Elijah turned his gaze on him, holding it longer than necessary. He didn't answer right away, giving the man a moment to marinate in his own words. But that stare, steady, unblinking, made the captain feel smaller than he'd ever felt in his career. "Protocol," Elijah repeated slowly, his voice quiet but resonant in the tense silence. "Which section of your protocol authorizes you to humiliate a paying customer? Or did you add that one yourself?" The cabin went still. The passengers suddenly felt as if they were sitting in a courtroom. The captain, once that's the absolute authority on this plane, now stood like an intern being grilled before a board. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Any defense he offered would only make this worse. And his silence in front of the witnesses might as well have been an admission of guilt. Elijah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His voice was steady, cutting. "Do you know how many times I've heard the phrase, 'according to protocol,' used as a shield for disrespect? How many times it's been an excuse to cover someone's personal prejudice?" He paused, letting it sink in. "I wonder, if I wasn't wearing this suit, if I wasn't a black man, would you have done the same?" The captain flinched. That question didn't just strike him, it rippled through the entire cabin, touching every passenger who had smirked or scoffed minutes earlier. A man in the back lowered his champagne glass, suddenly unable to swallow. The woman in the navy suit stepped in, trying to diffuse the tension. "Mr. Carter, I assure you there will be a full report and appropriate disciplinary action. Would you like to move to the VIP lounge while we—" "No." Elijah cut her off, leaning back in his seat, arms folded, gaze fixed on the window. "I'll stay here, and I'll watch how you fix this humiliation, right now." The cabin fell silent again. No one dared to move. Can you picture what comes next? When Elijah decides to resolve everything right here, in front of them all. First class hung heavy with silence. Every eye was on Elijah. He didn't stand. He didn't need to raise his voice. But everyone could feel that his next words would shift the entire plane's atmosphere. Elijah lifted his head, staring straight at the captain. His calm, razor-sharp gaze made the man instinctively take half a step back. "Which rule," Elijah began, voice low and even, "allows you to insult your passengers?" The captain opened his mouth, but Elijah didn't give him the chance. "Get off the plane, now." The words dropped like a gavel. The captain froze. His mind was no doubt racing. He can't mean that. He wouldn't. But the name that had just been spoken, Elijah Carter, CEO of the airline, had ripped away any illusion of his power. "Mr. Carter, Elijah," he interrupted, still not looking directly at him. "Not Mr. Carter. From now on, you'll address me the way any employee addresses their boss." A murmur swept through the cabin. The passengers weren't just witnesses anymore, they were watching a dethroning in real time. And the most astonishing part, Elijah hadn't even stood up. The director of flight operations inhaled sharply, stepped forward, and placed a firm hand on the captain's shoulder. "You heard him. Leave the cockpit. I'll bring in the reserve captain." If he had any pride left, this was his chance to cling to it, but there was no fight left in him. Slowly, the captain nodded, turned, and walked out, his face burning as if he'd been slapped in front of the world. Elijah didn't bother to watch him leave. He turned to the woman in the navy suit. "And make sure it's in the report he's demoted. No need for a board meeting. I want it done today." His voice wasn't raised, but it reverberated through the cabin like a judge's gavel. The passengers, once his judges, now looked at Elijah with a mix of awe and unease. No one would ever again suggest he'd bought the wrong ticket. Elijah exhaled slowly, as though this entire exchange had been nothing more than routine business. He tilted his head, that thin, knowing smile returning not a smile of victory, but one that warned them all. "This is only the beginning. Do you dare imagine what Elijah will do next, now that the entire plane and everyone on it is in his hands?" The plane touched down with a slight jolt, but the weight inside the first-class cabin was as heavy as an earthquake. The relief pilot, who had just taken over the cockpit, announced curtly, "We are making an emergency landing to handle a special situation. Please remain in your seats." Special. That word froze the passengers in place, but their minds spun. Special was now a veil behind it. Everyone wrote their own script: terrorism, police, and arrest, but no one dared to ask. No one wanted to disturb the commanding silence sitting in the row of Elijah Carter. A few passengers had already pulled out their phones, recording everything. One clip showed Elijah making a phone call. Another captured the captain being awkwardly asked to leave the plane. Another, the operations director bowing his head to a passenger. These videos, within hours, would escape the confines of first class and become the hottest topic on every social media platform. The cabin door opened. The ground air rushed in, carrying with it the chaos that awaited. Airport security, airline staff, and even a few reporters who happened to be there for another flight crowded the jet bridge, all eyes fixed on the man who had just rerouted an entire flight. "Is that him?" someone whispered. The question quickly spreading. Elijah said nothing, paying no attention to the murmurs. He stood, adjusted the collar of his suit jacket, a small gesture radiating absolute control. One passenger couldn't hold back their frustration and shouted, "We're stuck here because of one man." The complaint fell flat. No one joined in. They all understood this was not just one man. The crowd swelled, phones held high. A quick-witted young reporter squeezed to the front and called out, "Mr. Carter, can you tell us what happened on the flight?" Elijah stopped, turned his head, his cold, sharp eyes swept over the crowd. He didn't answer right away. The delay itself was a command, forcing silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and clear. "Write this. A captain and a flight attendant forced this plane to stop because they couldn't imagine someone like me sitting in first class." That sentence was enough to ignite the space. Several people pushed their phones closer, knowing this clip would spread like wildfire. Elijah walked on, each step parting the crowd that had no strength to stand in his way. Can you imagine what awaits when this story escapes the walls of a plane and touches the world? Within hours of landing, the story was no longer confined to a single flight. It exploded, surging through the internet like a flood. A clip, less than 30 seconds long, capturing the captain saying, "First class isn't for you," was first posted by a passenger in seat 3C. In under an hour, it had over 1 million views. The number climbed with every breath. Social media was ablaze outrage, ridicule, debates. No one was indifferent. Hashtags. Black CEO and exposed airline climbed to the top of search trends. Under every post, thousands expressed outrage. It's 2025, and this still happens. He paid for his seat. Why treat him like he doesn't belong? Others added biting sarcasm. Maybe, to them, first class is only for people who look appropriate. TV commentators quickly joined the frenzy. A morning news show aired the clip, asking, was this an isolated mistake or a snapshot of deep-rooted prejudice in the service industry? Hosts fumed, debating issues that seemed old but still haunted modern life: power, race, and social standing. And of course, brands didn't miss their chance. A famous coffee chain tweeted, "In our space, every seat belongs to everyone." Millions liked it, both solidarity and clever marketing in one stroke. Elijah didn't need to speak. He let the internet do the work. His silence, once so unsettling in that first-class cabin, became an amplifier. He didn't need to explain. The images and words already told the story. At airline headquarters, phones rang non-stop. The PR team scrambled to craft an official apology, but every draft was torn apart. None seemed enough to smother the wildfire of public rage. Across town, a group of students recorded a reaction video, holding signs. "First class belongs to everyone." They laughed, but with a daring edge. "Thank you, Elijah Carter, for showing us someone can still make the powerful bow their heads." In one night, a seemingly casual phrase, "First class isn't for you," became a symbol of arrogance laid bare. And the man humiliated yesterday was now the face of a movement demanding respect. Can you guess what Elijah will do now that public opinion stands firmly behind him? In the days before the incident, this airline proudly flaunted its slogan, "Diversity and Inclusion." They hosted equality seminars, printed thick sustainability reports, and published glossy images: a smiling female captain, a flight attendant of color shaking hands with a passenger. Now, those very images were being shredded online as bitter jokes. People spliced the airline's ads with the captain's words. "First class isn't for you." One viral post, shared over 1 million times, mocked diversity and inclusion: as long as you look like we expect. Words once used for marketing were now weapons against the carefully crafted corporate image. In the boardroom, executives sat like survivors of a crash. The head of communications presented a crisis plan, a press release, a video apology, promises of reform. Every proposal was shut down by a single cold question from a board member. "Has Mr. Carter said anything yet?" Elijah didn't need to. His silence was an indictment. Photos of him at the airport walking tall through the crowd, eyes unflinching, circulated with captions like, "This is how one man makes an entire system bow." And the captain, he became the face of the airline's failure. His name appeared in headlines: the man who brought an airline to its knees before its own CEO. Reporters called his family. Colleagues gossiped. His chances of salvaging his reputation crumbled. Customers began canceling flights. A major business leader declared, "If they treat their own CEO like that, I can't imagine how they treat lower-level employees." The market reacted. The airline's stock plunged before midday. In the quiet of his office, Elijah watched it all unfold. No statements, no TV appearances. He let those who once controlled the narrative drown in the chaos they created. And he knew silence, at this moment, was more powerful than any speech. No storm of shame could hide one truth: Elijah now held the reins of the entire airline, and no one could guess where he would steer it next. Can you imagine Elijah's next move now that both the public and power are in his hands? The boardroom on the 35th floor of the airline's headquarters had never felt heavier. The glass walls overlooking the glittering city did nothing to ease the oppressive gloom inside. Board members sat around the long wooden table, no one daring to speak, though every glance, every flicker of the eyes carried pure panic. At the head of the table, a large screen played a loop of the viral clips the captain being forced out of the cockpit, the operations director bowing his head in apology, and most striking of all, Elijah, sitting motionless with his eyes half closed, as if everything was unfolding exactly according to his plan. Each replay only deepened the wound to the airline's dignity. The CFO tapped his fingers on the table, his voice trembling. "We're losing millions of dollars by the hour. Stocks are down 8% in a single day. Shipping contracts are being delayed." The head of communications jumped in, voice quick and strained. "We need a statement immediately. A public apology, a promise to reform, a heartfelt video, something we can post by tonight." And then what another voice cut in from the far end of the table, laced with sarcasm. "We say we're sorry and hope social media forgets, when the man who was insulted is sitting right there." All eyes turned to Elijah Carter, the silent figure at the head of the table, as still as a statue. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't look at anyone. Instead, his gaze lingered on the city beyond the glass, as if this meeting was just one detail in a far larger plan. "Mr. Carter," one board member finally dared to speak. "What do you want us to do? How you handle this will define the company's future." Elijah turned his head. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't show anger. His tone was even, cold, deliberate. "I let them create this storm. Now, I will be the one to steer it where I want." He paused, looking at each person in turn. "We are not just handling a scandal. We will show everyone this: when someone disrespects our customers, especially out of prejudice, the consequence will not be just an apology." The room fell silent. No one dared to exhale. Elijah sat upright, placed his hands on the table, his decision already carved in stone. Calmly, but with finality, he said, "The internal investigation begins now, and those involved will no longer have a place in this company." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an order. Can you imagine what Elijah will do next to turn this media storm into a counterattack the entire industry won't forget? Elijah pulled his gaze from the window and faced the table fully. The room went still, no more tapping fingers, no more scribbling pens. He clasped his hands in front of him, leaning slightly forward, a small gesture, yet enough to make them all feel like students awaiting a teacher's verdict. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and steady. "We're sitting here talking about stocks, financial damage, protecting the company's image. But has anyone here stopped to think about how our customers feel?" No one answered. Eyes darted nervously. Elijah continued, each word like a hammer strike. "If a black CEO, a paying customer, someone you should have treated as a valued guest, was treated like a troublemaker, publicly humiliated by a captain and a flight attendant, then what does that mean for an ordinary customer?" The question landed like a blow. It needed no answer. They all knew. A board member tried to speak, "Mr. Carter." Elijah raised his hand, cutting him off. Don't give me another line about individual mistakes or retraining. This wasn't an accident. This was the result of a culture you've allowed to fester, a culture that believes certain faces don't belong in first class. He stopped, letting the words seep into the air. On the screen behind him, the clip of the captain saying, "First class isn't for you," was frozen at the exact frame where the captain's eyes dropped with contempt. Elijah glanced at it, then back at the table, a faint, bitter smile curling his lips. "You've plastered diversity and inclusion across every ad campaign. Good for you. But let me be clear, those posters mean nothing if our service culture treats a person of color like they don't belong here." The boardroom drowned in shame. The head of communications stared at his notes, hands trembling slightly. The HR director discreetly removed her glasses, dabbing at reddened eyes. Elijah leaned back, his tone slow but unrelenting. "I don't need apologies. I need a plan. A plan that guarantees no one, regardless of race, gender, or appearance, will be humiliated when they step onto one of our planes." He looked around, meeting every pair of eyes, "And I will not leave this room until we have it." The words nailed the air in place. This was no longer about appeasing the public, no more blaming individuals. This was a revolution, beginning right here. Can you imagine the next strike Elijah will deliver to force the industry to confront itself? Elijah didn't need more words. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick set of documents, placing them on the table. The sound of paper on wood cracked through the room like a gavel in court. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice low but commanding. "The captain from that flight demoted, effective immediately." A few murmurs rippled, quickly silenced when Elijah's gaze swept over the room. The entire crew involved suspended until the investigation is complete. And let me make it clear, this investigation won't be a formality. It will cut through every layer of our service policies, every procedure, every ingrained habit we have. He opened the folder, pulled out a printed document, and signed it with a sharp, decisive motion. "I want a comprehensive report on customer policies in 45 days. Not pretty words for a poster, but real protections for every passenger." No one dared to breathe. Executives who once dominated meetings with arguments now bowed their heads, scribbling notes. One person finally managed to ask Mr. Carter, "Don't you think we should wait for shareholder feedback before announcing these decisions?" Elijah turned to him, smiling faintly, not to reassure, but as if humored by someone missing the point entirely. "I don't wait for shareholders. I protect this brand before they lose faith completely. If anyone wants to object, remember who's in this chair." The communications director, who had been silently taking notes, cautiously asked, "How do you want us to frame the announcement?" "Not as an apology," Elijah replied, his voice sharp as a blade, "as a commitment. Show customers they matter enough that not even a captain stands above them. Show employees that anyone, whether a flight attendant or a top executive who disrespects a passenger's dignity, will pay the price." He stood, collected the documents, and concluded, "From today, we're not just selling tickets, we're selling safety and dignity. Anyone who can't deliver that won't be working here." Those words weren't a proposal, they were a strategic declaration and a warning. Can you imagine how Elijah will turn this crisis into a turning point that redefines the entire airline? Elijah Carter didn't bury the scandal. He turned it into a weapon. While the board still wrestled with old-school PR tactics, press releases, primetime apology videos with executives reading scripted lines, Elijah had already seen another path. He didn't just want his airline to survive the crisis. He wanted to use it as an opportunity to redefine the company's entire culture. "Stop thinking about putting out a fire," he said at the Monday morning meeting. "We're going to turn this fire into a torch." The directors exchanged bewildered looks, but Elijah didn't give them time to react. He clicked on the screen, revealing a plan with a simple title, "First Class Belongs to Everyone." "We will not let people remember this incident as a scandal," he said, each word deliberate. "We'll make them remember it as the beginning of a movement. From flight attendants and captains to executives, everyone will relearn what it truly means to serve. And customers, no matter what they look like, will feel that. He laid it out instead of dodging public scrutiny. The airline would launch a global campaign about the right to be respected when flying. Using Elijah's own experience as the starting point, he didn't just want internal reform. He wanted to make it public to turn the airline from a laughingstock into a model for accountability and change. "You want us to use this incident as a marketing campaign?" the communications director asked, unable to hide her disbelief. Elijah leaned forward, smiling. "No. I want to make it a declaration, so that a first-class ticket is no longer a symbol of power reserved for a few, but proof that every customer has a place here." He didn't need to shout. His calm tone carried more weight than any demand. This wasn't a proposal, it was a mandate, a vision. Elijah knew exactly what the public loved: a spectacular reversal. And this time, he would write the script for it. When the meeting ended, a few executives whispered to each other, "This could be the biggest gamble we've ever made." But Elijah didn't see it as a gamble. To him, it was a chessboard, and he was already several moves ahead. Can you imagine how Elijah will turn that slogan into action and force the entire airline industry to change? The first class belongs to everyone. Campaign didn't start with a social media post or a polished commercial. It began in closed-door training sessions, where every employee, from flight attendants to senior managers, was forced to confront one question: who deserves respect on this flight? Elijah personally attended the first session. He didn't speak much, just sat in the back row, observing the faces that, just weeks ago, still believed first class was the territory of a certain kind of passenger. Then, to break the tension, he stood and shared his experience on that flight. No dramatics, no embellishment. He simply told the story as a passenger who had been diminished, and how that humiliation became the tool for transforming an entire system. "Don't think of this as a training," he said. "Think of it as a mirror. Look into it and ask yourself, when someone walks into that cabin, do you see a passenger or a problem?" That message spread like a spark. The campaign quickly expanded. The airline released short films capturing the real experiences of passengers, from blue-collar workers to entrepreneurs, artists, and students. Each was asked the same question: what makes you feel like you belong here? There were no voiceovers, no slogans. The raw, honest answers turned those films into a living declaration. Social media erupted again, but this time with support. The hashtag #FirstClassForAll emerged, sparking countless personal stories, people who had once felt scrutinized in first class, and even airline employees admitting they, too, needed to unlearn old ways of seeing customers. Media experts commented, "They've done the unthinkable, turned a scandal into a cultural movement." Newspapers that had once condemned the airline now analyzed how Elijah Carter flipped public opinion like a chess master. Even rival airlines were forced to respond, some announcing plans to review and improve service policies. Elijah smirked when he heard. He knew they weren't doing it for customers, they were doing it because they feared being left behind. Within 2 months, the airline's image had completely transformed from a punchline into a symbol of facing mistakes head-on and rebuilding. But Elijah wasn't done. He still had one piece left to play, and it would make the entire industry take notice. Can you imagine what final move Elijah is preparing to close this game? Within 3 months. The first class belongs to everyone. Campaign hadn't just salvaged the airline's reputation, it elevated it to an unprecedented position. The entire aviation industry was now looking to them for a lesson they had once assumed would bury Elijah Carter. The company headquarters was redesigned with massive portraits, passengers of all classes, races, and nationalities seated comfortably in first class. But the most striking image hung in the main hallway. Just outside the executive suite, a portrait of Elijah himself. The man, once humiliated by his own employees, was now celebrated as the architect of the rebuild. Some employees whispered as they walked past Strange, just a few months ago, They treated him like a troublemaker. Another replied, "Now we bow our heads to him every morning." The change was so fast, so deep, and for Elijah, it was as sweet as revenge. In meetings, the same executives who once avoided his gaze now parroted his language. "Respect is our primary product." They repeated it like scripture, as if they had invented it themselves. Elijah just sat back, listening. A faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips, half satisfied, half amused. Even the communications team, once terrified of the crisis, now flaunted Elijah's story as a case study at international conferences. They boasted about bravely confronting mistakes to rebuild, though they never mentioned that every idea had come from the man they once tried to push out of first class. Elijah didn't bother correcting them. He didn't need verbal credit. He had gained something far greater absolute power in the very house they once thought he didn't belong in. The former captain, the man who uttered those fateful words, was now erased from the industry. Mandatory cultural training sessions still opened with the infamous first-class clip, but Elijah was no longer introduced as the victim. He was held up as the embodiment of resilience and leadership. To the public, Elijah Carter's name was now synonymous with transformation. Articles called him the man who turned humiliation into power, but to those who understood, it carried a sharper, more ironic message. Never think you can define someone by a single look of contempt in first class. Elijah knew every gaze was different now, but he still wasn't finished. Can you guess the final move Elijah is about to make, the one that will ensure no one in the industry dares underestimate a passenger again? The press room at the Grand Meridian Hotel was so packed that even a soft cough echoed. Reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder, cameras lined up in thick rows, flashes firing like they were hunting a celebrity instead of a CEO. Every major and minor outlet was there. Everyone knew today's press conference wouldn't be just another statement. Elijah Carter stepped up to the podium. He wore a deep navy suit with a gray tie, his stride slow and deliberate. He carried no notes. No teleprompter, just rested both hands lightly on the wooden stand and swept his gaze across the room. His calmness stood in sharp contrast to the frantic tension of the crowd. "Mr. Carter, are you suing the captain?" One reporter shouted, desperate to get a question in before the event started. "Will you involve other airlines in this initiative?" Another immediately added. Elijah didn't answer. He tilted his head slightly toward the event moderator in the corner, a small nod. The room fell silent. He didn't have to ask for quiet. True power, they say, is when you don't have to command, and yet you are obeyed. He waited a few seconds, long enough for everyone to realize they were now in his world. Then he began. Voice low and steady. "Thank you all for being here. I know you're not just here to hear about one incident on a flight. You want to know what happens next." A few reporters nodded. Elijah continued. "This past week, I've heard many questions. Was this simply a personal insult? Or is it part of a larger picture of bias and service? The answer is simple. It's both, and I will not stand by and let it happen again." He paused, locking eyes with the cameras. Some asked why I wouldn't stay silent. My answer is this: silence, sometimes, is complicity. But today, I want to prove something else. Real power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be present. A ripple of murmurs ran through the room. Cameras hummed, devouring every word. Elijah knew he was controlling the space with the pace and weight of each sentence. And to prove it, he leaned slightly forward. "I will announce the next step, a step that will force everyone to rethink how we treat the people who board our planes." The room held its breath. Can you guess what Elijah is about to announce? Something that could change not only his airline, but the entire industry. Elijah didn't open a folder or read from notes. He lifted his head, staring straight into the blinding lights of the cameras. In that moment, all surrounding noise seemed to disappear. When a person, Elijah began, each word heavy as stone, has to prove they deserve the seat they already paid for. That is no longer service. That is humiliation. The words landed, freezing the room. A few reporters forgot to type. Some glanced at one another, as if to confirm they'd heard it right. He didn't stop. We can take pride in our slogans, our campaigns, our speeches about inclusion, but they are nothing more than pretty curtains if, in reality, a passenger can still be treated like an intruder just because they don't fit the image of what first class is supposed to look like. Elijah stressed the words first class like he was tearing down the facade in front of everyone. It wasn't just a cabin, it was a symbol of hierarchy he intended to dismantle. He stepped forward, the light from the flashes cutting a sharp line across his face. Remember, this planes don't see skin color, seats don't see race, and the sky doesn't belong to any one group of people. Only humans create those divisions, and I will not allow them to continue. In the rows of reporters, someone nodded silently. Another whispered, "This isn't a press conference, this is a speech." Elijah let them sit with his words, then lowered his voice, forcing them to lean in. Today, no one boarding our planes will ever have to prove they belong. They belong the moment they hold their ticket. A wave of applause broke out from the back, spreading through the room, but Elijah didn't smile. He knew this wasn't a moment for celebration. This was a declaration of war against the prejudice ingrained not just in aviation, but in society. He raised his gaze, letting the cameras catch his unblinking eyes, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, he paused. Then that's how we know we're doing the right thing. That sentence alone was enough to make headlines explode in real time. But Elijah wasn't done. Do you want to know the final stroke, the move that would force the entire industry to rewrite how it delivers service? Elijah bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the swelling applause, then stepped away from the podium. There was no politician's wave, no photo op smile, just a slow, steady walk toward the exit. Cameras tracked his every move, his hand lightly adjusting his suit button, the shine of polished shoes reflecting the red carpet to the door. Reporters swarmed, shouting questions. "Mr. Carter, will you expand this policy industry-wide? Do you have a message for the airlines that criticized you?" But he didn't stop. Elijah didn't need to answer. His silence was the answer. In the lobby, a group of young airline employees stood waiting. Unsure whether to greet him or step aside, they froze. As he passed, Elijah stopped, met their eyes, and said simply, "I'm doing this not just for our customers. I'm doing it for you." Then he walked on, leaving them stunned and thoughtful. On social media, clips from the press conference spread like wildfire. When a person has to prove they deserve the seat they paid for, that is no longer service, it is humiliation. That line became a hashtag, printed on t-shirts, and turned into banners for social justice groups. Inside the airline, Elijah's portraits now hung in training rooms not for worship, but as a reminder one moment on a flight can shake an entire system. Captains, flight attendants, ground staff, everyone knew the standard had changed. Other airlines scrambled to hold emergency meetings. Some quietly adjusted their service policies. Some tried to imitate the first class belongs to everyone campaign. But none could match Elijah's precision and authority. He hadn't just changed one airline's story. He forced an entire industry to look in the mirror. Elijah exited the hotel and stepped into a waiting car. He didn't glance back at the reporters still calling his name. As the door closed, the last captured frame was his face calm, almost cold, but with a glint of defiant pride in his eyes. A man once humiliated had taught an entire system its lesson without raising his voice. And if you think this is the end, wait. Elijah Carter has never stopped at just one victory. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy. justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.